Welcome back to Ryan and Brian's Bible Bistro. I'm Ryan, and that's Brian. Say hi, Brian.
Hi, Brian.
And this is the Bible Bistro podcast, all about the Bible theology and all things related to the Christian faith. Brian, welcome back.
Yeah, it's been a while. We've been doing various things and busy and traveling and all kinds of those summer things that you do in the summer.
Yes, we have wanted to get back here, but our schedules have just not aligned. You've been
crazy.
You've been traveling. I've been working. I've had a busy season
I'm not working?
here. No, I'm saying you're working. Just
It has been busy. You know, ministry has those busy seasons sometimes, and we're both doing class, so trying to get those things done.
Schools.
So.
Yes, I'm wrapping up a semester here. You're getting close to wrapping up a semester too.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
we're getting there. But we're back to the bistro.
And we've got good stuff because of those classes. We've got some good material. We got some things we've been reading, and
we got stuff, and we've got two guests coming very soon.
We're excited about.
They are locked in.
We've been hyping them all season, and here they are. We finally have them. So
yeah. Absolutely. Well, Brian, what do you want to talk about today?
Well, we're going to have on, I'll go ahead and say Jason Staples, who we've mentioned a couple of times already, and his book, you got it there. I'm trying to remember the exact title of it.
Paul
Israel
and the Resurrection of Israel.
Resurrection of Israel. Paul and the Resurrection of Israel. We both read it, super enjoyed it. I had an opportunity to hear an online discussion with him in my class, and so it was a good experience. And so he agreed. He's got a busy schedule himself, but he agreed to come on. And so our next episode, we think, will be with Jason Staples. But I wanted to talk about, one of the things I loved about his book. One of the things I said about it is, it made me think about several passages of scripture differently than I ever had, and in a convincing way. And I'm pretty convinced by his overall thesis, which we're just going to mention and let him kind of unpack it a bit more when he's on. But you can see it there in the title, Paul and the Resurrection of Israel. He's saying that really the mission to the Gentiles was connected to God's promise to bring all of his people out of exile. And we'll say a little bit about how he makes that argument today, but the overall arching thesis of his book is really interesting in that. And but there are several places in his book that he makes an interesting argument, and I want to just look at one of those. And it's we're calling this the end of the law, I think. And it comes from Romans chapter 10, verse 4. We're going to look at that larger section of Romans 10, 1 through 13. And I'll go ahead and say Staples' book is really focused on the interpretation of 9 through 11, Romans chapters 9 through 11. Although he does exegesis of Romans 1 and 2 as well. I mean, it's a pretty thoroughgoing book. But that's really his focus, is what do we mean? Well, it's really, you could kind of narrow it down to say, what do we mean when we say all Israel will be saved? And of course, that's a pretty controversial passage.
Oh yeah,
there are different eschatological views that understand that differently, and I think he really gives a solid way of understanding that is, as far as I know, never been proposed in the modern times in precisely the way that he does. But let's start at Romans chapter 10 and verse 4. Do you have that there in front of you, or do I need to read that? Go ahead and just read that verse for me, because this is kind of what we're basing this section on, and there's a section of his book that's titled this as well.
Yeah, and I want to say this is the NIV, so it's going to have
the 2011 NIV, right?
Yeah. So it says, Christ is the culmination of the law, so that there may be righteousness for everyone who believes.
And it's that word culmination of the law that's the issue. So the word is telos. The Greek word is telos. And I've talked about this word before. It often is translated end. And so that's why you've seen Christ, the end of the law. But this word telos in Greek has a little bit more subtlety to its meaning. And culmination, I think that's why the NIV 2011 has changed it to translate as culmination, because I think the 84 did say end of the law. It can be goal. You see this in a title of a book that I've mentioned before that I really like. It's by Craig Kester, Revelation and the End of All Things. He's kind of playing on words there too, because end, we think about, well, the book of Revelation is talking about the end of the world, right? But he means end also in the way that we use the word to say something like, what end are you trying to get at, or what are the ends of this process? What's the goal? What's the point that you're moving toward. And so this is the idea. Christ is the culmination or the goal or the end point of the law. And so that there may be righteousness. That's the reason, for the purpose of righteousness for everyone who believes. And I've always said, anytime I've looked at Romans chapters 9 through 11, to me, the key word is all or everyone, right?
Hmm.
It's talking about whether Jew or Gentile, or in this case, we're going to talk about Israel. Everyone who believes will have this idea of righteousness. Now, let me go back and kind of say this: righteousness was one of the issues, right? This is what God in the law, and I'll go ahead and say the Staples is talking about the end. What if we talk about the literal end of the law? If you think about the five books of law, the Torah,
Hmm.
the literal end of the law is the book of Deuteronomy. And in fact,
Right.
it's chapter 34. And we're going to look at the end of the law here in just a minute. And he even thinks that Paul may be kind of playing on that
A
idea of
little
the
play
end
on
of the
words.
law.
Yeah.
Right. What's the very last part of the law, and saying something about it. But the problem there we have in Deuteronomy is that, God lays out these requirements for righteousness, but then he essentially says to the people, "You're not going to keep these. You're not going to be able to do these things." And so here he's saying that Christ has come in order to be the culmination of the law, in order to bring that to its fruition, or to its goal, to its end, for the righteousness of all who believe, so that we can live in a righteous way. And we'll hint a little bit about how he thinks that happens. So that's verse 4. Let's go back. I'm going to go ahead and read verses 1 through 3. Brothers and sisters, my heart's desire and prayer to God for the Israelites is that they may be saved. For I can testify about them that they are zealous for God, but their zeal is not based on knowledge. Since they did not know the righteousness of God and sought to establish their own, they did not submit to God's righteousness. And I'm not going to spend too much time talking about. We're going to have on in a few weeks another guy that's dealt a lot with this. I'm not going to kind of talk about the older view of the contrast between the righteousness of God and this idea of righteousness of their own, in kind of the old Lutheran sense of the idea before the new perspective. We're not gonna spend too much time talking about that, but what I want you to notice, a couple things here. The first is this use of the word Israelite, and this is
Mm.
part of what Staples argues, is that this is a very unusual word for Paul to use, and he really does this interesting thing in his book where he shows that scholars over and over again use the word Jew and Israelite interchangeably. But
Hmm.
his point is Paul doesn't. And in fact, Paul uses it very rarely. Only 17 times in his letters does the word Israel or Israelite occur. And Staples' point is whenever Paul uses it, it's with very intentional purpose. And he does not mean the same thing by the word Israelite as he means by Jew.
Right.
Okay. And here you have to kind of think about the story of the Old Testament. The word Jew in Greek is Judaioi, which can also sometimes you see it translated Judean. This is a question in the Gospel of John as well, because that's the most frequent use of this word Judaioi in the entire New Testament. It refers in the Old Testament, after we have the division of the nations, and actually even before that. I hadn't realized this. I just recently preached through Second Samuel. Even before the divided kingdom, you have the reference to the people of Judah and the people of Israel. And
Right.
Israel, we often think about as the entire nation, but in the Old Testament, Israel's really talking about those 10 northern tribes.
Right.
Judah and Benjamin are the southern kingdom, but then Israel is another way that you can refer just to those 10 northern tribes. That's one of the ways that it's referred to. And it becomes confusing because we tend to use the word Israel interchangeably for the nation as a whole. So what Staples' thesis is that Paul is very intentionally here using that word Israel. Do you want to very simply explain kind of what conclusion he comes to on that, or do you want?
Yeah, I
I was
mean,
going.
so basically, his he. I will say this about Dr. Staples is that he looks at all the literature.
Yeah.
like extra biblical literature and all that stuff. But his premise is that Israel in the Old Testament is cast out into the nations. It's
Hmm.
cast out into the world and is made part of the world because of disobedience. But that in Israel becoming part of the nations, and in Greek in the New Testament, the word that we translate as Gentiles is also nation.
Ethne, right? It's the same
Ethne.
word.
Yeah,
Hmm.
yeah. And so that in bringing in the Gentiles, the nation, that God is in fact bringing in the northern tribes. He's
Which,
a
yeah,
reformation of the northern
which
tribes.
is just fascinating. Now it's been for a long time, even at least since the time of N.T. Wright's at least popularized this, that that even in the intertestamental period and in the New Testament period, even though the Jews, the Judeans, were back in the land, they still saw themselves as an exile. And his argument as part of this is that the entire nation had to come back. That was God's promise that I will
Hmm.
bring you back, right?
Yeah.
And I'll say this about the nations, and we're going to read some out of the Old Testament here in just a little bit. This is part of what he's changed. I can't hear that the same
I
way
know.
again, right? And
Uh-huh.
that's what's so fascinating is the idea is you're going to be scattered into the nations, but then he says they become so indistinguishable from the nations that in order for them to come back, that the Gentiles have to be brought in as well. The nations have to come in, and the northern tribes come in as a part of them. And the fascinating thing is then you see the way God works in an amazing way. I would say we see his providence at work in that as well, which just kind of blew me away.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's kind of what we see to that point. Now let's look at Romans chapter 10 verses 5 through 8. So we looked at chapter 10 verse 4, and then I looked at the first three verses, and then let's talk about these verses 5 through 8.
Yeah.
Moses writes about this righteousness that is by the law. The person who does these things will live by them. And that's a couple of different places, but at least we see this in the book of Deuteronomy. And I'm going to come back to that. But the righteousness that is by faith says, do not say in your heart, who will ascend to heaven, that is to bring Christ down, or who will descend into the deep, that is to bring Christ up from the dead. But what does it say? The word is near you, it is in your mouth and in your heart. That is the message concerning the faith that we proclaim. Now, the interesting thing about this is these quotations are from Deuteronomy chapter 30.
Hmm.
And, and chapter 30 is a very famous passage. It's where we have, toward the end of the book of Deuteronomy, Moses essentially saying, here, I've given you these words and I've set before you today life and death. And the idea is if you keep these things, you'll live, but if you don't, then it's going to mean death. And so here's let me go back to that just real quickly. Moses writes this about the righteousness by the law. The person who does these things will live by them. So there's this idea of, I'm setting these words before you to give you life. Now, if we go to Deuteronomy chapter 30, these quotations are from Deuteronomy 30 as well. I wanted to read verse 15 first of all, though. It says, see, I set before you today life and prosperity, death and destruction. For I command you today to love the Lord your God, to walk in obedience to him, and to keep his commandments, decrees, and laws. Then you will live and increase, and the Lord your God will bless you in the land that you're entering in to possess. So he's referring to this idea that the law was given really to give life to the God's people. But if your heart turns away and you are not obedient, and if you are drawn away to bow down to other gods and worship them, I declare to you this day that you will certainly be destroyed. You will not live long in the land you're crossing the Jordan to possess. This day I call the heavens and earth as witnesses against you that I've set before you life and death, blessings and cursings. Now choose life so that you and your children may live, and that you may love the Lord your God, listen to his voice, and hold fast to him. For the Lord is your life, and he will give you many years in the land he swore to give to your fathers Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So that's the idea of this idea of life. I set life before you this day. Do you have Deuteronomy 30 there in front of you?
Yeah, I sure do.
Now, look at what comes just before this. These are the quotations that we have here from Paul, starting back up in verse 11. Go ahead and read 11 through 14. This goes right before what we just saw in Deuteronomy
Yeah.
13, 15
Y-
through 20.
Yes. Now, what I'm commanding you today is not too difficult for you or beyond your reach. It is not up in heaven so that you have to ask, who will ascend into heaven and get it and proclaim it to us so we may obey it? Nor is it beyond the seas so that you have to ask, who will cross the sea to get it and proclaim it to us so we may obey it? No, the word is very near you. It is in your mouth and in your heart so you may obey it.
Now, that's really interesting. And I've always wondered what this meant in Romans chapter 10, where Paul says, who will ascend into heaven? That is to bring Christ down. And what Staples is saying here basically is that this is pointing toward the coming of the Messiah, that the Christ, the Messiah, will come down, and he will then, notice what it says, who will ascend into heaven to get it and proclaim it to us, preach it to us, so that we may obey it. It is being fulfilled in Christ. That is the culmination. That is the end of the law.
Mhm.
Is that he will ascend? He will come down from heaven. The Christ will come down. Nor is it beyond the sea. And he goes into great detail here about Paul seems to be referring. Sea can also have this idea of the depths, right? That's one of
Mhm.
the words that's used in the Old Testament to translate this idea. And so who will go into the depths, right, in order to bring him up? And so here's the idea that, as Paul says, the word is very near you. It is in your mouth and in your heart, so you may obey it. And what Staples is essentially saying is that the Messiah has come and he's brought the Spirit in order to transform our hearts so that we are able to obey it. Now, there's at least a couple more things I want to say about this, but any comments or questions to this point, or anything you want to add to that I've missed to this point?
Yeah. So, I mean, how have you interpreted this in the past, Deuteronomy? I mean, has it
The Deut-
been the Deuteronomy passage? Has it been an eschatological thing here,
Not in the
going
same
to
way
heaven?
that he has, not in the same, not to the extent and to the depth that he has explained how Paul is using this in order to refer to the Messiah, to the coming of the Messiah. Not in that very clear language is the way I would say it. I've understood that it's a reference to these passages in Deuteronomy, but I
Hmm.
thought Paul was just kind of referring more to this. Here's Moses laying before them death, life, and death, right?
Hmm.
And I will admit, and I think Staples even makes reference to this. I will admit, this is one of those places where you see one of these weird Paul things, and you're like, in fact, I've even taught this to my students. I always say, well, this is some kind of rabbinic interpretation, and rabbinic interpretation is just weird, right?
Hmm.
But he's given it to us in a way that makes a lot of sense. That basically, and this is the part I'm going to get to. I mentioned to you when Moses gives these things to the people, and what God says through Moses is, you're not going to be able to keep these things, right? You,
Hmm.
you're going to fail, and it's going to require the Messiah to come and make this transformation. I haven't mentioned this yet, but Staples also brings in and Jeremiah 33, this idea of the new covenant. When you'll be given hearts of stone will be taken from you. You'll be given hearts of flesh.
Hmm.
Is an important point for him as well. So I don't know. Did that answer your question? Though
Yeah. I no.
I've always seen this kind of reference to Deuteronomy, but just generally speaking, Moses saying, here, this is set before you, and Paul refers to this, to
Mhm.
this, and now the righteousness has come through Christ, is the way that I would have understood this in the
Okay.
past.
I
So
just, I just wonder, like how you maybe looked at that Deuteronomy passage in the past, and
I think
not in the
this.
context of Paul, but even
Oh, I see.
in its
In
immediate context.
Deuteronomy,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. I mean, I see it as I've always seen Deuteronomy as the final sermon before they go into the promised land, and he's kind of just giving, we've always said he's laying out these blessings and curses, and he's saying, here's the warning,
Hmm.
here's the commands, but here's the warning if you don't keep them. And very interesting. I've often thought Deuteronomy. I mean, he says, don't make yourself a king. You don't want to get yourself a king when you go into
Hmm.
the nation, but when you do, right? When you set a king over
Right.
here, here's what's going to
Hmm.
happen. And there's all these kind of warnings he gives to them. But there's also, and I want to get to this. There's one more thing in this part of the book that Staples refers to that I had never seen before. As much as I've looked at this and thought about these things for a long time, I'd never seen, and it makes a huge difference, because this is about the way that you know the difference between having Moses speak to the people on God's behalf, right?
Hmm.
And then Christ as God incarnate coming down and speaking to us directly is what makes the difference between the change and the transformation that takes place in us, I think. And this is what this idea of the end, the Messiah is the end of the law is pointing toward. The Christ is the end of the law is pointing toward, I think. Let's go up in chapter 30, Deuteronomy 30 again. Let's look at the first three verses. I know I'm skipping all over these verses, but it says this. This is the beginning of that chapter. When all these blessings and curses I have set before you come on you, and you take them to heart wherever the Lord your God disperses you among the nations. And there's one of those passages, whenever he scatters you among the nations, and when you and your children return to the Lord your God and obey him with all your heart and with all your soul, according to everything I command you today, which sounds very Jesus, right? Obey him with all your heart, with all your soul. Whenever he does this, and when you return. So I find this interesting. He doesn't say if, right?
It's
It's
when.
it's when this happens, and when you return, then you will obey him with all your heart, with all your soul, according to everything I command you today. Then the Lord your God will restore your fortunes and have compassion on you, gather you again from all the nations where he scattered you. And so again, this is that promise that he's going to gather, all of his people back to the land. This is the promise that we have. So that's the kind of the promise that we have to this part. Now, I mentioned there. Let's see. There's one more thing I was going to say, and I can't remember what it was now. Well, so let's look at the actual end of the law. I'm sure it'll come to me later, but chat after we finish recording. So
Perfect. That's a perfect time for it.
let's look at the very end of the law. Then this is Deuteronomy. Oh no, I know what it was, and yeah, we're going to get to this. I think. Hang on a second. Yeah, we haven't gotten to this yet, but we will. So look at Deuteronomy chapter 34. This is the very end of the law. This is the death of Moses, obviously, verses 5 through 8. Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in Moab, as the Lord had said. He buried him in Moab in the valley opposite Beth Peor, but to this day, no one knows where his grave is. Moses was 120 years old when he dies, yet his eyes were not weak, nor his strength gone. The Israelites grieved for Moses in the plains of Moab 30 days until the time of weeping and mourning was over, and moaning. So then read verse 9.
Now Joshua, son of Nun, was filled with the spirit of wisdom because Moses had laid his hands on him. So the Israelites listened to him and did what the Lord had commanded Moses.
So do you remember that idea of, then you will listen to me and you'll do what I said? There's this really subtle little thing, the way that the story is told here, because Moses stands for the law. In fact, in Second Corinthians, I'm working on Second Corinthians chapter 4 right now, and in Second Corinthians chapter 3, um, Paul says wherever Moses is read, and what he means by that is the
The law.
law, right? So here we have Moses passing away, literally, and then we have in Hebrew Yeshua,
Hmm.
right? Then we have Yeshua coming with the Spirit, which is what the promise of the Messiah is. And the Israelites listened to him and did what the Lord commands. And Staples is saying this is kind of a subtle way that this is pointing toward the coming of the later Yeshua, which is the name Jesus, right? This is
Hmm.
this is Jesus, the coming of Jesus, uh, at the end of the law, right? The passing away of the law, the coming of Yeshua with the Spirit, and enabling the people to keep this promise. I thought that was really interesting. But then look at verses 10 through 12. And this to me, that's a little speculative, but I find it very interesting. But look at verses 10 through 12.
You
Since
got it.
then, no prophet has risen in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face, who did all these signs and wonders the Lord sent him to do in Egypt, to Pharaoh and to all his officials and his whole land. For no one has ever shown the mighty power, performed the awesome deeds that Moses did in the sight of all Israel. That's the end of the law. Okay,
Hmm.
that's literally the end of the Torah. No prophet has risen in Israel like Moses. Now, this seems to be a very clear reference to an earlier passage in Deuteronomy. Do you have that, Deuteronomy 18, 14 through 16? Do you have that?
I will here in two
I
seconds.
thought I thought I'd had you get that already. Obviously, I didn't.
Oh, that's right. Deuteronomy 18:14.
14 through 16.
The nations you will dispossess, listen to those who practice sorcery or divination. But as for you, the Lord your God has not permitted you to do so. The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among you, from your fellow Israelites. You must listen to him. For this is what you asked the Lord your God at Horeb on the day of the assembly, when you said, let us not hear the voice of the Lord our God, nor see this great fire anymore, or we will die.
Okay, two things. I've quoted this passage a ton. Deuteronomy 18:15 is referred to in the Gospel of John, that Jesus is this prophet like Moses who will arise, right? He is the
Mhm.
fulfillment of this. So it's interesting, though, at the end of the law, again, Paul may be right making this reference to the end of the law, that by the time you get to Deuteronomy 34, it says, to this day, no prophet has risen like Moses. Even though in Deuteronomy 18, there's a promise, hey, there's going to be a prophet like Moses who's going to arise. And
Mm.
so I think Paul calling attention to this and now saying this is now fulfilled in Christ. Christ is now the end of the law. He is the one who is the prophet who's risen like Moses, and we're to listen to him. He's the one who's brought all these things. That's the first thing I thought was really pretty interesting and kind of cool. Thoughts on that or anything?
Well, yeah, I mean, this is deep cuts. I mean, I think both you and I, when we read Staples, not deep cuts, but it's a
Yeah,
way to, as you said it, you said many times. Once you see it, it's hard to unsee some of
yeah,
these things, these
yeah.
connections. Um, yeah, I mean, it's some of these things that we read sometimes, and it's easy for us to skip over unless our minds are really
Right,
really tuned to it.
right. Here's the other thing then I want you to see. Read that verse 16 again. And
For
this is
this
something, again, I've never, in all my years of studying the Bible, I'd never noticed this before.
For this is what you asked the Lord your God at Horeb on the day of the assembly, when you said, let us not hear the voice of the Lord our God, nor see this great fire anymore, or we will die.
Because what we have is throughout the Old Testament, this kind of idea or rumor, or I don't know what you want to call it, this tradition that you can't see God face to face, right? You can't come face to face with God or you'll die. And, I've always understood, well, God called Moses specifically up on the mountain in order to be the uh, intercessor with the people. But do you see what it says there? It says that you said you didn't want to see me, right? How
Mhm.
does it say it? That on that day when you
They said, let us not hear the voice of the Lord our God, nor see this great fire anymore, or we will die.
look back in Exodus chapter 20, and I had never seen this before until Staples pointed it out. This
Okay.
is, when they come to the mountain and Moses is ready to go up on it. They spend 3 days setting themselves apart, which I've taught that tons of times. They're sanctifying themselves, right, preparing themselves for the coming of the law. It says, when the people saw the thunder and lightning and heard the trumpet and saw the mountain and smoke, they trembled with fear. They stayed at a distance and said to Moses, speak to us yourself, we will listen, but did not have God speak to us, or we will die. Moses said to the people, do not be afraid. God has come to test you, so that the fear of God will be with you to keep you from sinning. The people remained at a distance while Moses approached the thick darkness where God was. The idea is that God wanted the people to come up on the mountain and for him to teach them himself. But they wouldn't. They shrank back is the word. They were afraid and they would not. And they said to Moses, you go and do that on our behalf. Right? We're
Mhm.
afraid to hear the word or we will die ourselves. And Moses is basically saying you need to hear it from him, and this will if you come up here face to face with him, this is what will keep you from sinning. And
Mhm.
they're afraid to do it. So back in Second Corinthians chapter 3, then that's what I think is going on when Paul talks about this passage, and you might remember very famously. It's the passage about um, well, let me go ahead and read Second Corinthians chapter 3, verse 12. Therefore, since we have such hope, we are very bold. We are not like Moses, who would put a veil over his face to prevent the Israelites from seeing the end, telos again, of what was passing away. So you remember in the story back in Exodus, when he comes down off the mountain, he is glowing with the glory of God, and the people say, "We need you to put a veil over your face. We can't stand to look at you." Even the fading glory of coming to face with God. And so here's what it says: but their minds were made dull. For this day, the same veil remains when the old covenant is read. It has not been removed because only in Christ, only in the Messiah is it taken away. Even to this day, when Moses is read, a veil covers their hearts. But whenever anyone turns to the Lord, the veil is taken away. Now, the Lord is a spirit. Where the spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. And we all, who with unveiled faces contemplate the Lord's glory, are being transformed into his image with ever increasing glory, which comes from the Lord, who is the Spirit. And so the whole idea is that the Messiah has come in order to bring the Spirit to enable us now to be in the presence of God, and that's what it, that's what John says, we all beheld his glory. We saw his glory himself. John chapter 1 verse 14. So he has come so that we can see now God face to face, and we can be transformed. Our hearts can be changed so that we can obey, and we can keep the law by the Spirit, as the Spirit lives and works within us. So I found that part very interesting as well, and very helpful in understanding this. But I just never noticed that God essentially called the people. He prepared them and called them to come up on the mountain and hear from them, and hear from him themselves. And they're saying, no, we don't want to. And so it's not until we find the Messiah coming that we now hear from him directly and are transformed in this way.
Mm,
So that was the other thing I thought was interesting in this.
yeah. So
Anything
let's take
else
this.
Yeah, go
Well,
ahead.
let's take this back to Romans 10 then. We started in
Okay.
Romans 10, and then let's with all that we've kind of gone through, let's go through this. So when we say Romans 10:4,
Hmm.
Christ is the culmination of the law, so there may be a
Hmm.
righteousness for everyone who believes. We see this as that Christ is the what we're speaking to God face to face now. He's bringing the
I
Spirit
think
within.
so. And the Spirit is enabling us to obey him. The Spirit is enabling us to do what in Deuteronomy says you're not going to do. You're not going to keep the law. You're not going to keep these commands. Again, I'll go back to this idea that I'm giving you, the person who does these things will live by them, right? That you'll have life if you keep these things. And so, I think this goes along with the idea that the Messiah has come so that we can have true life in keeping the commands of God and doing the righteous things of God. We're being transformed, as Paul says in Second Corinthians, into the very image of the Son. We're being
Mhm.
made like him in this way. So,
Yeah. So how does this play out? I mean, we see this that there are, we look at Hebrews and we look back in the Old Testament, we see these righteous people that have been part of the story.
sure.
So do you see this? We're saying we're unable to
Hmm.
obey this. Do you see this as a nation piece with individuals inside of it? Like, how do you see that playing out? Because
That's
there
a
is a righteous remnant.
sure. Yeah. Even the righteous remnant, though.
They're
Uh,
not perfect. Yeah.
and that's what, I think that's the thing that Paul says. um anything that I counted to my credit now is I consider to be rubbish, right? Even my best efforts at this are rubbish compared to the surpassing greatness of knowing, I'm going to say, the Messiah, right? Knowing
Mhm,
Christ. That's what he says. And that's the other thing Staples is really big on, is that, and I agree with him. We don't see Christ as a title. We think of it as a name, right? We think of it as in reference to Jesus. But this idea that I want to know this one who's come to fulfill the promises that God has made to us. And so, this, it's not this righteousness of my own any longer, but it's now the surpassing greatness of knowing Christ, knowing the Messiah. So even the righteousness. So who are you thinking of particularly?
I, I
Who
didn't
would
have
be the
anybody, but
greatest? Who would be the greatest? Joseph would probably be, for me, one of the greatest, or Hezekiah.
mhm.
But even their greatest. Um, you know, Jesus says this about John the Baptist. He says the least one in the kingdom is going to be greater than he, right? Even the least one in this new covenant will be greater than that. So I think the good news of the coming of the Messiah, right? As he
Hmm.
brought the Spirit, he transformed us so that we are able to receive the Spirit, and in that we're being changed, we're being transformed to be the people that God has called us to be from the creation, right? So that's how I would see it. Yeah.
Okay. Very good. So
Any other
Brian,
questions or yeah?
what's the so what here? What's the so what? We've kind of
Well,
this is a deep
yeah.
dive.
I
People,
it is.
people
It's
are
a
like,
little.
I
This is kind
love
of a
Romans or I
Bible.
hate Romans.
This is
Uh,
kind of a Bible nerd thing, I say. This is a relatively minor point, but I do think it is important in seeing. Again, it's another way that Paul is pointing to the overall surpassing greatness of Jesus, right? And the way that we are dependent upon the coming of the Messiah and upon His faithfulness to God's covenant plan in order for us to be called to Him. I didn't answer this question you mentioned earlier. This idea of, is this an individual thing or a nation thing? And I think we are called to be a part of God's people, right? And there are certain expectations that come along with that. Certain what's the word I want to look I want to say here. There are certain behavioral markers that go along with that, right?
mhm.
And so I think the Spirit is what enables us to do that, whereas previously we couldn't. And it's kind of the same idea, right? That they were, the way the story seems in Exodus, they're putting God at a distance and saying we can't handle this. We will die. And I think it's a rumor. I don't, Moses seems to have seen him face to face. Um, Jacob seems to have wrestled with him, right?
Mhm.
Which is interesting. The word Israel means wrestles with God. It's this idea of this struggle, this wrestling, and so it's an interesting way to think about it. I think.
Okay.
Anything else that you find interesting
I
in this
well, I don't
part
want to
of
go.
the
Yeah, I don't want to go too far into it since we're gonna have Dr. Staples on here coming on. There's I think you said as you read the book, it was probably one of your favorite books you've read in a while.
since for people who know me, I said since New Testament People of God by N.T. Wright, which that's if you know me, that's saying a ton because that book was transformational for me as well. And I think it's transformed the way I see certain things, not in the overall overarching breadth way that New Testament People of God kind of changed my perspective, but I think in very meaningful ways in looking at the New Testament. And I'm going to say I've been impressed. I've subscribed to Staples Substack, and I'm going to recommend that to people when he's on. If you haven't already, he's putting stuff out that's very interesting on a regular basis. I asked a minor question about this because he makes the point, well, and we'll probably talk about this, so I won't go into it too much detail, but that Jesus, when he sends out the 72, says specifically, um, uh, I want you to go to the house of Israel, do not go to the nations. And so to the ethne, and so ethni, and so I'm trying to I'm trying to understand. Okay, if you're saying this is the way that you bring them back. So I asked about this in Matthew, and and he basically gave this full formed discussion, right? Of well, yeah, here's my answer to that question. You need to understand it within the whole context of Matthew. And I'm hoping that when we have the interview, I'm hoping he'll kind of talk through that with us because that to me was breathtaking. Basically, he's thought about the way that Matthew uses the word Israel. There's some very interesting places that Matthew uses this word, and I think what this book has done for me, a couple things it's done, but one of the main things it's done is to help me be more sensitive to where the word Israel is used
Yep.
and nations,
Yep.
and to think about how the biblical writers are understanding this in their context. The strength to this for me is what I said when I was explaining this to somebody else. I said, well, he's saying that Israel is referring to the northern tribes. The way it is in the Old Testament, the way the
Yes.
way it would have been in the scriptures of the early
Hmm.
church. And And we have, because, and this is what we talk about when we talk about interpretation, we've moved away from that culture to the point that we don't have that same sensitivity. And I hope, I'm going to ask him this question. I hope he'll share about how he first came to this insight. It's really an interesting
Hmm.
thought. And I'll go ahead and say this, and maybe he'll repeat it. There was another of the students in his class that asked a really great question, and basically, it's like, how do you get to a point where you see things like this? And he said, I've always had this saying, and his is very similar. I've always said you need to read large portions of Scripture quickly, and you need to study small portions of Scripture in depth. And it's
Hmm.
kind of when you're doing both of those things is when you're going to notice some of these connections. Some of the connections that I've seen have been through that. Looking, one of the best things probably ever happened to me was teaching Intro to the Bible, where every semester I'm going through the entire story of Scripture in 13 weeks.
Yeah.
And you do that over and over again, and you become very familiar with that text material, so that when you see something, you're like, oh, wait a minute, nations, this makes this connection over here, or Israelite, and he said something very similar, but basically he said you need to read this stuff, and you mentioned the extra biblical literature, the Second Temple material.
Hmm.
You need to read this stuff to the point that it is your culture and it's your worldview. He says, when you're making jokes in using those kind of references, then you've got it right. When you're joking about Second Baruch,
Yeah.
then you
You're the
know that
only
you've
person that gets it. You're the only person that
right.
gets the joke to yourself. Yeah.
But you've immersed yourself in this literature, because that's the world. The way I've always said it, and the way N.T. Wright says in New Testament People of God, to quote that, is that a worldview is made up of stories, of narratives, and you got to understand those stories. That's why I'm so insistent on understanding the Old Testament. And I know my people, and when I'm preaching to them, get tired of me preaching the stories of the Old Testament, but you can't even hope to begin to understand the New Testament until you've thoroughly understood the Old Testament.
Hmm.
You've heard me say about apocalyptic literature before, about the book of Revelation. The only thing you need to understand the book of Revelation is you need to thoroughly understand the entire Old Testament, right?
And then you've
And
got it.
and New Testament eschatology. And if you understand those two things, then the book of Revelation explains itself. But we don't spend enough time immersing ourselves in the stories of Scripture to the point that they're our second nature. So,
Yeah.
and here I am. I've tried. I've spent a long time in Scripture, and I'm still constantly seeing things that I'd never seen before. Just preached through David's later life in Second Samuel, and there are things there that I'd never noticed before, that were helpful to me. And like I said, this thing that Staples pointed out about that God was calling the people up on the mountain and they wouldn't go. And then
Yeah.
and then in Deuteronomy, Moses kind of slams them for it, right? That's the
I,
part I
I
didn't
I
mention.
had
But
never really seen
yeah,
that.
yeah,
That they'd been invited to go up there.
it just kind of, you assume, well, they're not supposed to. They're not supposed to come into the presence of God, but He's calling them to. And that's the other interesting thing. And I've said this before about the Jacob narrative. He calls the place where he wrestled with God Peniel, and he says, "Because I saw God face to face, and yet I lived." Uh, right, and so
Yeah.
it's a rumor that you can't see God face to face. And that's what I think Paul is referring to in Second Corinthians. He's saying we all now with unveiled faces reflect the Lord's glory. We're seeing His glory. We see it in one another. We reflect it to one another, which that's what I'm writing on. We'll probably talk about that later on. What I think's going on there. I think it goes along with Gorman, which we've mentioned, cruciformity too. But anyway, it's probably enough. Anything else? Anything
No,
else
I
you
don't.
want me
I think
to
that's it.
rant
No,
on? Okay,
no, that's good. I'll have this book up on our.
sure.
You can go to the website, thebiblebistro.com. I'm going to forewarn you. I'm going to forewarn you. The binding is not great. The material is fantastic in this book, but you'll see on the Amazon reviews the binding's not great.
We've we've got what is it they say at Festivus? Uh,
Oh,
it,
grievances,
the grievances. We have some
airing of
grievances,
grievances.
right?
Here's my
it's not.
grievance.
Here's mine. I got it on Kindle, and the page numbering is wrong on Kindle. So get your
Cambridge
act
Press.
together, Cambridge University Press. You think Cambridge
What are you,
University Press?
smarties? A bunch of smarties. Print your books better.
You're no Oxford University, right?
Oh,
So,
ooh, Oxford would have printed it right. Anyway,
well, there goes our underwriting from Cambridge University
yeah.
Press.
Well, you can redeem yourself. Uh, Paul and the Resurrection of Israel, Jews, Former Gentiles, and Israelites by Jason Staples. And he's
And
going to
then
be
his
our guest.
earlier book as well. We'll mention
Yes.
that. Well, let's mention that when he's on next. We can.
Yeah,
we can do
but
that.
he's going to be our guest. And so, Brian, I really appreciate this. Is a little foretaste of what we're going to talk about with Jason Staples.
Yeah, I'm glad we
Plenty
glad
of
we
good
finally
stuff.
got together and were able to put together an episode. So
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Brian, thanks so much. And we are recording very soon with Dr. Staples. So the episode's coming. Yes,
Yep.
it's happening. Unless something dramatic happens. So thanks so much, Brian. And we'll see you next week.
see you soon. Bye.